G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for the Monaco Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Before we jump into, first of all, my watch list for the upcoming race week and what my team decisions need to be heading into Monaco, we'll take a quick look at how my team performed in Imola. I had 146 points and not such a great result given the score on here. I thought heading into the weekend, it was probably a great time to gamble on non-Red Bull assets. McLaren and Ferrari both looked exceptionally strong throughout the 3 practice sessions. And I thought with a wildcard in my pocket, in the event anything goes awry, I can certainly correct any drivers or constructors should I need to get Red Bull back in down the line. And in the lead up to the Grand Prix, things looked pretty good. Carlos Sainz and Oscar Piastri had both qualified in the top 5. Sergio Perez had gone out in Q2. And across the board, the point simulations were looking pretty good. So I was feeling pretty good about the decision. It was also the highest points projection build for my budget available on F1 Fantasy Tools. So that filled me with a little bit of extra confidence heading into the weekend that this was something to move towards, at least for this race, maybe even the next race too. And the fact I was able to get out Logan Sargent, who even though didn't DNF, and I'll get onto that in a minute, is a driver that just doesn't seem to fill me with any confidence whatsoever, and even terrifies me to the extent that a DNF for him can always just be around the corner. He's been pretty good this season, I will be fair. He's probably copped a little bit of slack from me more than most, and the Miami DNF wasn't even his fault. But it just is the kind of asset that I'd like to avoid in my fantasy team. There isn't really that level of consistency that you have from a lot of the other drivers on the track. And the pace itself from that Williams is probably the least competitive of all cars. So wasn't a great sign for me. And the fact I was able to part ways with him after qualifying, he had that -5 for not setting a representative lap time, made me think it was probably the best for me at that point. Now, Alex Albon was the only driver that DNF'd in Imola, and when you own the only driver that does DNF, your team and your rank for the weekend is going to tank. And that was probably, when I look on paper, the biggest difference between scoring what most teams scored versus what my team scored. You put that -20 to one side, and the -10, which I still think wasn't a decision I regret, nor one I would hesitate in making again. But that would be, an extra 30 points, 176, which was probably close to average for what a lot of teams scored in Imola. It was a pretty dour race, fantasy-wise as well. There were no chips, so no teams really scored above 200. And if you did, congratulations, because you were one of the very few. But the fact that heading into qualifying, Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen looked woefully off the pace at times. So I thought, why not take a punt? And a punt I did. I just don't think I'm ever going to make significant ground kind of playing by the meta lineups every week. And it's a decision I would 100% make again. Maybe Sainz is not necessarily the best DRS boost option right now, but I was very happy with McLaren and Ferrari coverage. And as I said, I've got the wild card to correct any of these decisions if I think Red Bull are worth bringing back in Monaco. So 146 points across the board. Pretty happy. As I said, qualifying, all things looked pretty even, all things considered. I'll just quickly show this on screen here. These were the 3 lineups that I was toying with heading into the weekend. And the Sainz, McLaren, Ferrari, and Piastri build, which was the top build, was what I had at qualifying. So 71 points, -10, 61 points. Very even to the Verstappen, Red Bull, Ferrari, and Sargent lineup I had before the deadline. And then the Leclerc, Red Bull, Ferrari, and Tsunoda lineup I was also thinking about prior to the deadline stream on FanAmp an hour before qualifying. So at, I guess, the end of qualifying, I was pretty much even with the 3 lineups I'd either thought about or previously had, and realistically was very content. It was obviously the Max Verstappen brilliance that we all come to know that was probably the major difference with my team, and Sainz falling back a position probably didn't help either. But look, I was pretty content with the result on the first day at the end of qualifying. So it's just one of those things where things could look good on Saturday and then Sunday's a completely different story altogether. So again, not the end of the world, long season ahead of us, but that's kind of where my team was at come the end of Saturday. Now, before I jump into how my team is looking for this weekend, I wanted to take a look at a couple of drivers on my watch list. I had this segment in my race week preview video before the deadline last week, but I thought I'd put it in team selection so the information is more fresh. One driver in particular that jumps out at me is Charles Leclerc. Now, Charles averages the second most points among all drivers in F1 Fantasy this year, so it is very much an attractive prospect to own someone of his caliber when you're averaging upwards of 30 points per race week. Now, Max, he's in a class of his own. He's 35.9 per race week. But on these non-sprint weekends where there's less points on the table, having a driver that can still get close to matching Max's production is something that's seriously worth considering. Lando Norris as well, another driver that's perhaps emerged as an alternative to that, but he's now above 25 million. So his ability to go up in price more so than Charles is reduced as he's in that tier A asset class that we've learned has less room to grow in terms of budget than your B tier and your C tier assets. And he's also, Charles, in my opinion, when he's on, in terms of competing for a podium or the race, one of the front runners to score the driver of the day. We know that Lando Norris at the moment has a mortgage on that award, but Ferrari and McLaren have scored, I think, more than 15 out of the last 16 driver of the day nominations. So if Charles is on for a P2 or looking to win the race, then I think he's an incredibly good shot at winning those extra 10 points. Overtakes and positions gain for me, not as much of a factor for a driver that's going to continually qualify much further up the leaderboard and continue to contend for podiums. I think those statistics are more geared towards those budget drivers, those midfield and back marker guys. But he is one of the best value assets in the game, 1.27 million. Ferrari and McLaren are kind of in that territory at the moment. So he is value for money, and I think he's going to continue to go up in price, assuming he continues to deliver these great results week in and week out. 33%. I think there's not really going to be too many drivers, in my opinion, that are going to have a higher, a DRS boost option. I mean, that is going to have a lower ownership. Max is in the 40s. I know Norris, actually, I think he's lower than that. But again, he, at that tier A asset class, is probably less favorable. I'd say it's pretty close. You can make the case for both if you're not going for a Max Verstappen DRS boost. But I think at this price of Charles, he's in, I think it's 23 if I'm not mistaken, or around that mark. Super affordable. You're kind of knowing what you're getting, and Ferrari really look to have cleaned up those strategy errors. We've kind of known they're likely to turn out, most race weeks from what we saw in 2022 and 2023. So I really like Charles. He's heading into his home race at Monaco as well. So if he can avoid that Monaco curse, which has plagued him for so many years, I think he's certainly a decent shout. The other asset I'm looking at is the McLaren constructor. I currently own them in my team, and a lot of people move towards them when I mentioned obviously earlier around the kind of Red Bull fall off. Well, Perez, we know, seems to have that fall off as soon as we get into the European races. So if Red Bull don't look so good, even though their fast pit stops are probably keeping them in the fight fantasy-wise, McLaren become certainly an exceptional alternative. I think for me, they are one to consider holding if you don't already own them, just because I do believe that if Lando continually churns out these P2s, we know how good they are in the pit stops as well. And Oscar can, up until the weekend, up until qualifying, looked on for a really good shot at competing with Max and Lando for a podium with that grid penalty. I think if they can continually kind of reach those targets of P2, P3, P4 every week, I think they'd potentially even overtake Ferrari as the next best constructor after Red Bull at this point in time. Their points per million, 2.02, exceptionally good value as well. And I do think that from what we saw last year, if their upgrades are anything to go by, that kind of performance trajectory is only going to get better as the season wears on. We do typically tend to see other teams close the gap to Red Bull over the season. So I fully expect that if McLaren can continue to build on these upgrades that they've churned out successfully in Miami. Oscar got the full upgrade package in Imola. Then I definitely think they are certainly drivers to entertain. Now, I own Oscar and I own the McLaren Constructor already. Whether or not I continue to own both of those is yet to be seen for me, given I think there are certainly some other alternatives to developing my team. But I do think they offer at 16% a really good differential in the constructor department, given that most people inside the top 10,000, top 50,000 are going to be running Red Bull and Ferrari, or at least at this point in time, it seems that way. So if you're looking for a differential, I think McLaren is certainly one that can kind of swing the tides a little bit in your favor if they do have more good weekends. Oscar's not going to get grid penalties every single weekend. If anything, had he held onto that P2, I fully would have expected the gulf between McLaren and Red Bull to be much greater than it was, because it was pretty even, 59 to 61 over the Imola weekend. But I think the other thing just to keep in mind for Monaco in particular is that it's a track that you want to pile in on assets that qualify quite well. Max is a great qualifier. He's qualified on pole every race this season, but Sergio Perez worries me a little bit. So you could go for potentially a lineup like what I had on screen before, a variation of this where it could be Verstappen, McLaren, Ferrari, or something like that, because I do think that this could be, if Perez's struggles continue in the middle part of the season, Red Bull Constructor's probably one to avoid. But I'll just quickly look at my team for a few minutes. That's the F1 Fantasy Tools website. Just to see kind of how it's shaping up. As I said, we've got a lot of McLaren and Ferrari coverage at the moment. And I did point out the importance of qualifying. So having someone like Max Verstappen in your team this weekend could be paramount to maintaining that success, that point scoring kind of safety net that you're going to get from him every single week. But I do think, though, that on non-sprint weekends, and in Monaco in particular, where scoring is so low, I'm leaning towards going for Lando or Charles at the 2x spot because of that driver of the day upside. I know the Monaco curse does terrify me a little bit for Charles, but having 19.4 million to spare is one such idea I could take into the weekend. Now, it probably would, if I'm making more than 2 trades, necessitate a wild card, because I do think someone like Hülkenberg or Tsunoda as a pretty good qualifier on both accounts would be worth having. So if I do go down that route, I'd have 19.4. I could even think about maybe going for Fernando Alonso if I wanted to make that move in 2 trades. But I do think having Max Verstappen coverage in some respects is probably not the worst idea in the world. Fernando, though, just bringing up F1 Fantasy Tools to just gauge the kind of qualifying performance from Fernando. He's been in, except for the last 2 races, in Q3 every single weekend. And again, not so sure on Aston Martin entirely, but for a Monaco weekend, you want to have those good qualifiers because there are not going to be many overtakes. Not many people are going to move in the order. Hulk, another one who's qualified in Q3, 4 out of the last 7 races. Tsunoda, 5 out of 7. So these are probably the guys, Tsunoda, Hülkenberg, and Alonso, in that kind of favorable or attainable price point that many of us should think about opting into. But again, you've got the options of Leclerc, Verstappen. I mean, he's got a complete stranglehold on P1 in qualifying so far. And Norris as well, all excellent qualifiers. So I fully expect that they're probably one of the 3. These Norris, Leclerc, and Verstappen are one of the 3 drivers I'll likely be going for this weekend. But I guess if I do go for Verstappen and go for a McLaren Ferrari lineup, the most logical fit for me feels like Yuki Tsunoda, maybe Nico Hülkenberg. But I just hate having these guys here as well, Albon, Bottas, and Zhou. So if I do go down the wildcard path, then potentially Hülkenberg here, bring in Bottas for someone like Pierre Gasly. Just kind of brainstorming now. But I really feel like this lineup could be the foundations of a Max Verstappen, McLaren, and Ferrari team moving forward, if we get the impression from Monaco as well that Perez's form is really falling off a cliff, as it was the case 12 months prior. But that's very much my preliminary thoughts on my lineup. I'll be back with my final thoughts closer to the deadline. with some more formative and concrete views on kind of what my approach is for the weekend. But as always, guys, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you all very soon.